Next up, we're going to build out the user interface for the application. So we're going to create a bunch of templates. And so let's start off by creating the main template, which is going to be the list for our to-dos. So we'll list the to-dos and also be able to create new ones and see how many have been completed versus ones that are outstanding. So to create the main view, I'll use an iron generator called a template, and we'll create a template under the to-dos folder called to-dos list. Now this creates a couple of folders and files for us. And if you look up in the directory tree here, we have a folder called to-dos, and within that, a to-dos list folder that contains the files for the template. So we'll start off with an HTML, JavaScript, and style sheet file. And inside the HTML file is where we'll find the template HTML. So for now, I'm just going to say, create an H1 tag and say to-do list. And from our home template, we can just go ahead and render out this to-dos list, because that's going to be our main template. Or we could go into the controller and make the to-dos list the main template, but since we might want to put some other things on the home page, I'm just going to go ahead and do it this way. Okay, so together, let's build out the HTML for this template. I'll close the menu so we can get the full screen here. And we'll create a wrapper class here called to-dos panel so we can style this appropriately. And right up on top, I'm going to render out another template called create to-do item. We'll create that in a minute, but that's going to be the text box that allows us to create a new to-do item. Next, I'll have an unordered list, and we'll give it a class name of to-dos list for styling. And inside of this, we'll loop over all of the items that we have. I'm going to call these to-dos. And we'll go and we'll create each of these helpers and other templates in a sec. Okay, inside of this iterator, for each item that we have, I'm going to create a list item with a class of to-do item. And then I'm going to create a dynamic class. So we'll use a helper here that will give this an extra class if the task is done. And so if the to-do is done, we want to apply a class that will put a strike through indicating or a line through the task indicating that it's complete. And inside of the list item, we'll render out another template called to-do item. And this just lets us separate the logic or the UI of our app into multiple different templates just to organize it. Okay, one of the things we can do within each block is we can provide an else part. And this block will get rendered if there's no to-do. So if this returns null or it has an empty 0 count, then this part of the block will get printed out. And so we can create a to-do list item here with an extra class of empty. And I'll just write no to-dos yet. And then underneath this, let's render out one more template that will show us the count for completed to-dos over the entire set of to-dos that we have. Now when I say this, I should get some error because we haven't created these templates yet. So next up, let's come down to the console and create templates for each one of the child templates that we're going to use in the above list. So I'll say iron generate template, and we'll create another one called create to-do item. And then another one for to-dos count. And then finally one for the to-do item itself. Okay, so these are all the templates that we should need, and now the app is working again, but we're seeing the boilerplate HTML being printed in each of the child templates. Now, before we move on, let's go to the JavaScript for our list, for our to-dos list, and fill out the helpers for this main list here. And we're going to have two helpers that we created, or that we're using in the HTML. The first is the to-dos list itself, so this is what we're iterating over in our each block. And for this, we want to return all of the to-dos for the current user, so where the user ID is equal to the currently logged in user. And I want to sort those by the created at date in descending order. So the -1 will give me descending order. And then we have this dynamic is done class. So what we're going to do with this is if the task is done, So this will be the current data context for the document or the to-do item itself. And we'll say if the isDone property is true, then return a string called done. And this will be a CSS class that gets applied called done if the task is done. Otherwise, just return an empty string. All right, I think the next template that makes the most sense to do is the to-do item itself. And that's because that's the main template that gets rendered out for each to-do item that we have. So what we can do is go into the new to-do item template that was created here and start filling out the HTML for this. So I'll start off by creating an input of type checkbox, and the value or the name will be the name of the attribute on the document itself. So we'll call that isDone. And then we need a dynamic helper here that's going to check the box if the to-do is done and leave it unchecked if it's not done. And then the next div will be for the subject of the to-do, and then finally the action where we can click on the to-do and go to a particular link, which we'll create a bit later. So let me save that, and hopefully our list should have something in it. So over on the right now, you can see the first to-do that we created earlier. So here's our to-do, and I've opened up the Elements HTML debugging pane down at the bottom so we can see the dynamic classes being applied when we check this to-do is finished. Now we need to wire up the event handler to handle that case. So let me clear this, and what we'll do is go over to the to-do item JavaScript file and fill out the event handler. So there's only going to be one event handler here, and it's going to be for when we click on the input with a name of isDone. And when we do that, we're going to check and see whether or not the checkbox is checked. And if it's checked, we'll say that the to-do is done. And if it's not checked, we'll say it's not done. Now let's also grab the ID for the current task so we can update the right document. Again, this will point to the current to-do in the list. And then we can just simply call the update method on the to-dos collection. We'll update the document with an ID of the one for this current data record. And then we'll use the set modifier, and we'll set isDone to the value that we get from the checkbox. And then one last thing we need to do is create a helper called isDoneChecked, and this is how we're going to determine whether or not to check the checkbox based on the value of the data. So we'll see if the current to-do is done, then return checked. Otherwise, just return an empty string. And you'll see this in action in a second in the elements area of the debugger. All right, I want you to keep your eyes trained down here at the list item and watch as I check and uncheck this to-do item here. Watch the HTML dynamically change. So you see that CSS class that's just being applied and then taken away depending upon whether the checkbox is checked or not. And that's because the underlying data is being updated because of the event handler that we added over on the left. And then the done class is being applied if the to-do is done. And that's what creates this nice strike through here that we're able to get from that CSS styling. All right, next up, let's fill out the create to-do item template so that we can create new to-do items directly from the user interface. So I'll jump up here to the create to-do item and pull up the HTML for that. And then down below it, I can open up the corresponding JavaScript so that we can see both at once. All right, in the create to-do item template, we're going to use a form, and we'll just give it a class of create to-do so that it looks nice. Now we're going to handle two different cases here. One is going to be if the user is logged in, and the other is going to be if they're not. So if the user's logged in, so if there's a current user, else we'll do something else. And if there's a current user, we'll go ahead and provide the text box. And we'll give it a placeholder that says create a new to-do. And if they're not logged in, we'll just prompt them to log in. So the placeholder in this case will be sign in to create a to-do or to-dos. And I'll give it the read-only flag, and then I'll tell the browser that this should be read-only. Now when I save this, we should get a nice text box, and since we're logged in, it should say create new to-do. But if I log out, that should dynamically change or reactively change to sign in to create new to-dos. Okay, let's sign back in. And now we need to create an event handler for submitting this form and creating a new to-do in the database. So I can handle the event submit form. And the first thing I like to do in event handlers is at the very top, if I don't want the browser to use the default behavior, then call the prevent default method on the event object. And this way, if an error gets thrown somewhere in this function, we're still preventing the default, and so the form doesn't get submitted to the server. Then we'll go ahead and grab the subject. So I'll find the element that's of type input, and we'll grab its value. And we'll do a simple insert into the Minimongo collection. With the subject that we just got, we'll give it a created at timestamp. We'll say by default it's not done, and the user ID will be the currently logged in user. Then finally, we'll find the form that we just submitted and reset it. That'll clear the values or clear the text box. All right, let's go over here and try to create a new to-do. And I'm going to keep the console open so that I can get a sense of if there's any errors. So we'll create a second to-do and then press the enter key. That'll submit the form, and there we have it. We have a second to-do at the top of our list. We can make sure that it's wired up correctly by clicking and making sure that it completes the update, and we get a strike through, and everything looks like it's working okay. All right, we have one last template we need to complete for this page, which is the to-dos count. So let's come back over to our code and clean this up a bit and head over to the to-dos count HTML. This template will be pretty straightforward. We're going to create a wrapper div around this with a class of to-dos count for some styling. And then we'll create two helpers. One will be the total number of tasks that have been completed, and that will be divided by the total number of tasks. And so we'll say that we finished 1 or 2 or 3 out of 2 to-dos completed. And let's open up the to-dos count JavaScript file and actually add these helpers. So let's start off with the completed count. So we'll use a Minimongo query here, and we'll search for any to-dos for the current user. Where is done is true. And then we'll call the count method on the resulting cursor. So when I refresh that, we should see that 2 tasks are completed, but we don't have the total yet. So let's get the total count. And that will just be the total number of tasks, whether it's done or not. And now it shows 2 out of 2 to-dos completed. And what we should see is this is reactively updating if we change one of these to-dos to be not complete. So now it's 1 out of 2, and now it's 0 out of 2. So this completes the home page for the To-Dos app.